Good evening, and welcome to 7 Stories Up, The Secret Life of Legos by Daniel Konstanski. We're delighted to have you all joining us tonight at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. My name is Tim Smith, and I'm a supervising librarian here at SNFL. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making programs like this evening's conversation possible. I would like to encourage you to visit NYPL's website and take a look at upcoming programs like this one. We have an excellent lineup this season featuring new nonfiction, music, and more. We would love for you to join us in this space again. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Daniel Konstanski is the US editor for Blocks magazine, author of The Secret Life of Lego Bricks, and a passionate, lifelong Lego fan. He is an ardent student of the Lego Group, its portfolio of beloved products, and the adult fans of Lego, AFOL, community, having researched and written hundreds of articles covering every aspect of the hobby. Thanks to a collaborative working relationship with the team of in-house historians employed by the Lego Group, Daniel has been privileged to tell many stories from within the Lego Group itself and is considered one of the most knowledgeable and authoritative voices in the fan community on the company and its products. His most expansive work to date, The Secret Life of Lego Bricks, is the culmination of over 60 official interviews with employees past and present, along with hundreds of hours of research in the official Lego archive. In addition to writing about all things Lego, Daniel is also a builder who regularly displays on the AFOL convention circuit. He lives in Delaware with his wife and 3 children. Daniel will be in conversation with Alison Nellis, who is our supervising librarian of programming and outreach. It's now my pleasure to welcome tonight's guests.
Hi, Daniel.
Hello, Allison.
How's it going?
It's going well.
So before we get started, I want to ask you a very difficult question. What is the formula for a perfect Lego brick?
It's an excellent starting question. So there are 3 pieces of the formula for a perfect Lego brick, and they are a pet project, a boat trip, and a frigid winter visit. And so explain that a little bit, because that's probably not the answer you were expecting. So to start off, there was the original proto-Lego brick was actually a product called automatic binding bricks, and this is what they looked like. These were produced in 1949, and they were actually a pet project of the Lego Group's founder, a gentleman by the name of Ole Kirk. And he, it was actually kind of funny because he basically did this on his own. He was very interested in new technology, and after World War II, as plastics were emerging as kind of a new material that could be used in production, he went out and bought a molding machine pretty much against the will of everyone else in the company. And they were like, okay, we'll just let him have this. We'll let him mess around with it a little bit. And he ended up making these bricks, and they ended up selling them. And they really didn't sell very well at first. They were just kind of his pet project, and they just kind of let him do it on the side. And they were more or less ignored from 1949 for the first few years into the 1950s. Until that's Ole Kirk at his desk, which I've actually gotten to sit at in Billund. They still have it in his old house. It's super cool. But a few years later, his son Godfred was actually on he went to the first toy fair in Britain, looking for some inspiration after World War II. The Lego Group, they were started. The Germans had dominated the toy market before World War II, and they were kind of that industry was roaring back to life, and so he was looking for inspiration. So he went to this toy fair. Didn't really see anything. Kind of came back a little bit disappointed. But on the boat ride back, he ended up striking up a conversation with a gentleman who was on the boat with him, who was the main toy buyer at a department store in Copenhagen. And kind of off the cuff, the guy just kind of said, there's no system in the toy business. There's no system. And he didn't think anything of it, went on his merry way. But that just stuck in Godfred's head. And he talks about it in an interview years later. He was like, it just kept me up at night. I'd wake up in the morning and I'd hear there's no system. I'd go to bed at night, I'd hear there's no system. And so he ended up going and kind of looking at the entirety of the company's portfolio of products, seeing what he could turn into this idea of a system in his head. And the only product of the almost 300 that they were making at the time that he felt could meet that criteria were his dad's bricks that he had pretty much ignored up to that point. And so he got very homed in on it at that point and started really pushing for developing them and expanding them. They produced more types. And so they began to evolve the brick at that point. And then they created this, which was the first set of Lego official theme. This was called Town Plan. And this came out in 1955, a year and a half after that fateful boat ride. And originally, as you can see, they were kind of envisioning it as being scaled with HO trains. So the trains were a third-party product, but they thought, hey, we can build the environment around these. And that really kind of revolutionized the Lego brick, brought it up in popularity. Now, all of a sudden, people could see what you're supposed to do with them. Before this, it was all just loose bricks. But the problem was that they didn't stick together very well. As you can see here, it's all buildings. The vehicles are actually more like what we would think of as like a matchbox car today. They were, metal wheels and all of that. And so the problem ended up being, as they got more popular, all of a sudden it was discovered, you could see it on that first picture that I showed you, there's no tubes underneath. It's just an open hollow block. So all they would do is kind of stack them. There was a little bit of grip because of that slot, but they didn't stay together very well. So if you lifted something up, it would fall apart. And so as it grew in popularity, they began to get more and more complaints. And so it got so bad that the head of the German sales office one day drove up to Billund. It was about a two-hour drive. Billund is in the Jutland Peninsula of Denmark, just above Germany. And so he came, and he sat down with Godfred, and they just worked all night trying to figure out, okay, how could we make these bricks grip a little bit better? And this is actually where, to kind of make it a little bit personal for me. So when I first started writing this book, there were several different questions that I had in my mind, but the main one that I was like, okay, this is the one I kind of want to personally answer, was I wanted to understand why Lego bricks are the dimensions that they are. If you look at the length and width, they break down into very nice, even millimeters in dimensions, but the height is just the weirdest dimension. And I was like, why in the world is a Lego brick this height? And so I just, all throughout my 60 interviews, I just kept asking, figuring it would be a very straightforward question. Why is a Lego brick the height is? No one could tell me. And so it ended up, the answer to my story ended up intersecting. This is the announcement for the Lego system in play from 1955. But this ended up being the key piece. So that the head of the German sales office, a gentleman by the name of Axel, came up and met with Godfred, who was known as GKC within the company. And you can see it. They had this piece of paper that they used to design the old proto Lego bricks. And you can see on the left side there's all these different designs for ways to give the bricks more grip. So kind of in the center, you can see the tubes that they ended up with, but they had all these other designs as they just sketched and sketched and sketched all night long. And Godfred was very nervous that someone else would beat them to the punch, so they just patented all of them. So he just took it and patented, there's like, I think 16 different designs for how a Lego brick would be able to grip. And as part of my delving into the archive, I ended up finding the original patent application that they submitted all the way back in the 1950s. And at the back of it, there was a handwritten piece of paper where it was 2 equations that someone had sketched out. We think it might have been Godfred, we're not sure. And I was like, this has got to be it. Something about these equations is going to give me my answer. And so I messed around with them for like 3 weeks, trying to reverse engineer how they came about with them. And finally figured it out. And what it was that there was actually this set of proportions that they used. So one of them was named in the patent. It was called a module. But the other one was unnamed, and they hadn't really described it. So Lego let me name it. I got to call it a section. And when you understand the relationship between the modules and the sections, every Lego dimension becomes very clean divisions of either modules or sections. And so this was how we got to the modern Lego brick. They ended up patenting all of those designs, and then ended up doing experimentation to figure out which one worked best. And they chose the one with the 3 tubes underneath, and the rest is history. Now every Lego brick uses one of those. So that is the formula for a perfect Lego brick.
Thank you. So I'm assuming you actually you do like Legos. There's just a little bit?
Just a little bit. Just a little bit.
Can you tell us what your personal history is with Legos?
Yes, absolutely. So my personal history with Lego started back in the 80s. When I was 3 years old, my dad had a tradition of bringing back little gifts when he would travel. And one day he came back and brought me this. It's a tiny little Lego set for a 3-year-old, probably way too young. But it was this little set called Camera Crew, which I then years later, got to pick up when I got to tour the Lego Vault. There's a vault in Billund where they keep a copy of every Lego set ever made still in box. And they let you wander through there and you can pick them up and hold them. And so I got to reconnect with it years later. So, but this is where it started for me. So that was my very first set, and my dad had no idea what he had just unleashed when he spent that $3 on that Lego set and all the money he'd have to spend later every Christmas and birthday since. So this is where it started. I was a Lego maniac growing up, collected them all through childhood. Within the Lego community, we have this term dark age, and it's usually when you do this thing called aging out of Lego, usually in your teenage years. I never had that personally. I had what I call my period of no disposable income during college and right thereafter. But that I've always been very into collecting. And then as an adult, started doing large builds. So there's a whole circuit of Lego conventions all over the country where fans get together and will do big displays and things like that. So this was my COVID project with my daughter, who was a major Harry Potter fan at the time. Well, still is, but she's not as much of a Lego fan anymore, which is a real tragedy. But we had fun while it lasted. So I enjoy building. And then, as was mentioned in the intro, I'm also the U.S. editor for Blocks Magazine, which is a third-party fan publication that was started back in 2015 that me and a small group of others write for. So this comes out each month. So this has been a real blast. I've gotten to develop a lot of relationships within the Lego group, get to go over there once a year, and just kind of, geek out with all the designers and see all sorts of cool things. And so I've lived my best Lego life ever since that first TV crew back in the day. So.
And so what was the writing and research process like for this book? And an aside question, this book is laid out in an interesting way. It's laid out by topic. So let us know a little bit about writing a research process and that decision to lay it out that way.
Yeah. So the Lego group reached out to me. So there's been a real push within the last kind of about 10 years now, maybe a little bit less, to really kind of cater to the adult fans, to kind of make products specifically geared towards us, towards our age demographic, and that sort of thing. And so they wanted to expand that into publications as well. Up to that point, most of the book, or all of the books, had been targeted mostly at children. Things like the DK books, mostly focused on pictures and things like that, with a few exceptions, but mostly on the business side of things. And so, because of my work with Blocks Magazine, they ended up reaching out to me and offering to give me the chance to come in and do this. I don't think they had quite realized what that was going to look like, the types of questions a fan would ask as opposed to kind of what they were used to. And so it ended up kind of spiraling and getting much bigger than any of us expected, but totally awesome. So it also fell during COVID, so people had a little bit more time. And so I ended up getting to do over 60 interviews with employees past and present, going all the way back to people who were there in the 70s, all the way up to people doing the themes today. And what surprised me going through the process, because originally I was thinking that it would just be chronological, that I would just kind of go decade by decade, starting in the 40s and work my way through. But what I discovered in talking with all of these different designers was that none of the design process that they go through is linear. They are constantly pulling ideas that were tried years before, and they'll go back and pull out those designs and look at them and say, oh, can we mess with this? Can we make it work now? And that there were, things that they figured out back in the 80s that would then suddenly come back in 2010, and they would, figure out a way to finally incorporate it. And so the stories ended up not being linear. And the way that different products influenced one another, even across decades. I just found that to be really fascinating, that it was kind of this tapestry as opposed to this timeline. And so I ended up choosing to write the book that way because I wanted to try to capture some of that beauty that I had found in the way that they didn't do it linearly.
And you touched on it a little bit, but could you give us a brief history of Lego?
Absolutely. So the Lego story goes back. The kind of the first key date is actually 1916. Again, as I'd mentioned, we're set in rural Denmark. The Lego group has always been headquartered in a town called Billund, which is about 2 hours to the west of Copenhagen. It is in the middle of nowhere. Like if you ever go there, it is the funniest town. Like you just show up and there's farmland as far as you can see in every direction, and then all of a sudden here's this huge multi-billion-dollar company in this tiny little town of 5,000 people. It is this funny juxtaposition. But in 1916, a gentleman I'd shown you earlier, Ole Kirk, moved to Billund, and he purchased the local woodworking shop. And that's a little bit of a misnomer. I don't know if it's a translation thing or whatever, but when we say woodworker, to us, really the better way to think of it is he was a contractor. He was someone who would go out and build barns and dairies and churches. This is one of his structures from the 1920s. We think he's the one standing, kind of looking this way with in the center there, but so grainy we're not sure. And so he was doing contracting work, building large structures like this. Was actually doing fairly well for himself. But then the Depression hit in the 1930s, and it hit Denmark, especially this area, particularly hard. At that time, Denmark was primarily an exporter of pigs and pig-related products, and so everyone just completely lost their business almost overnight. And so all of his projects, whether houses, barns, all that, are directly tied to that industry, and so his work dried up overnight. But as it so happened, he was a member of this trade organization at the time that would send out these monthly newsletters to the various people that were part of it, kind of like today. It's a very similar pattern. And so these trade publications began including advice for people like him who suddenly found themselves out of work. And they said, well, what you should do if you're a woodworker, if you're a contractor like this, is instead of focusing on these big buildings, you should focus on small things like housewares and stuff that can be made very quickly and inexpensively and then sold to people to use in their homes. Things like ironing boards, ladders. And at the end of the sentence, they said, and toys are something else that you could do. And so Ole Kirk said, well, let's try it. And so he ended up, and at first he was focused on kind of the first things in the list. So we actually have a picture of it here. So this is the first round of things that he ended up making. You can see there, ladder, ironing board, and other things like that. And what he ended up doing was, because he was in such a tight spot financially, normally they would have scrap wood that they would just throw out. But in an effort to just maximize everything, he took the scrap wood, and that's what he made the toys out of. And then he would take all of these products, and he would go door to door and try to sell them. And lo and behold, what sold was the toys. Because parents were looking to give their kids a reprieve from all of the just misery around them during the Depression. And so he ended up selling the toys. And so over time, he just stopped, and you can kind of see it reflected in this. I mean, there's one ironing board and one ladder and about 20 different toys. And so that ended up being how he grew the business, was by doing the toys. And then eventually, like I talked about earlier, he moved on to plastic. And eventually then the Lego bricks, and the rest is history, as they say.
So this is a personal favorite of mine. My favorite kind of Lego motif is Lego trains.
Good choice.
But then also how that evolves into adding electricity into Lego. Can you talk a little bit about the Lego trains?
Yes, absolutely. So I showed you Town Plan earlier, which was the very first kind of Lego theme. And very quickly after that, and even at the same time, they started to do additional models. And trains, actually, one of the funniest things about trains, and you can see it in this picture, Lego train models actually predate the Lego wheel. They did trains before they had Lego wheels, so they had to use, rectangular bricks, which is just kind of a funny visual. So once they ended up building wheels and making wheels, trains were one of the very first models that they produced. So this is the original Lego train model. There's actually a bunch of different designs that I found pictures of in the archive. So they obviously were doing a lot of experimentation, but this is the one that ended up winning. No track. It was just a box that you could buy, and this even predates instructions. So you basically had to look at the model on the box and then try to recreate it as best as you could. For years, they had models without instructions, and Trains was one of them. But the big breakthrough was in 1966, and that was when they did the very first official Lego train line. So this was like the next theme after Town Plan. And this is what we call the kind of the classic blue track era. At the time, they struggled with production in terms of getting the raw materials that they needed for different colors. And so blue was easier to get, and so they ended up making the track blue instead of gray. Or some other color that we would think would be a little bit more accurate. And so the first Lego trains, this is most of the original 1966 train line. And they ended up having, it was really, it's kind of crazy. It was a free-for-all with Lego trains back in the day because they had 3 different types. So they had push-along variants, just that kids could just push along. They had these 4.5 volt battery ones, and that's the kind of box there in the middle. You can see the big chunky engine because it was these big old C batteries in this box. So they just didn't look right at all, but they could chug along. And then a year later, they ended up coming out with a inlay that you could put down in the middle of the tracks that was could conduct electricity, and then you didn't have to have the battery box. But all the electrical parts were interchangeable. So they had these chassis that you could swap in, and they sold the motors individually. It's like, my gosh, these kids Frankensteining all this stuff together. It's kind of crazy to think about now. But that model held for the next several years as you had these 3 types, and you could interchange, and each model could do each one. And that then led to a bunch of experimentation. This is actually a picture from a patent of a bunch of unreleased parts because they electrified the trains, and then they thought, well, hey, could we electrify other things? And so for years and years, there's actually a whole family of patents that you can track through the decades of the 60s, 70s, and 80s of the Lego group trying to crack how do we conduct electricity through builds. So this shows multiple different types of ways that they did it. So they had these foils, that's the flat stuff that you can see on the picture there. And then they actually had bricks that were going to be cast in metal or coated in metal. And then batteries and plugs and motors and all sorts of stuff. So there's all sorts of variants of this. They finally released a few pieces in the late 80s that were the only product ever made from this idea. But it was in the 80s that trains actually came to a real moment of truth. So in the late 70s, as the minifigure was being released, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit, but when the minifigure first came out, because trains had been there for so long, going all the way back to the 60s, and they were still using most of the same parts. They'd recolored some of them through the years, but for the most part, it was still all the same parts. And as the minifigure was coming, they were saying, well, none of these parts are scaled to the minifigure. We would have to completely redo all of our train parts in order to make them work with the minifigure. And so Trains was actually on the chopping block. They were very close to just saying no more Lego Trains, and that would have been it. But in 1980, there was a team of designers, and it was the funniest story. I got to talk to a couple of the guys that were on this team, and they said, well, we realized that Town had just come out, and Space had just come out, and Castle had just come out, and those were still kind of working their way through the market. And we realized we kind of had this gap year where we didn't need to make any new sets for those themes. And so they said, well, what if we just took the entire year's allotment of new parts, because every year they get so many new parts that they're allowed to make, and we just put them all into Trains. We'll just remake the entire line in 1 year. And so that's what they did. So to hear them talk about it, it was crazy. They had all these different models just all over the floor and spread everywhere. But in 1 year, they remade the entire line, scaled it all to minifigures. And this was what they came up with. And that's what basically Trains rode on through the 1980s. They introduced 28 new train sets in 1 year in 1980, which is unheard of. Like no theme gets 28 sets in its first, its debut year, let alone something that had been around for so long. So that was, and then from there they evolved it further into 9 volt and then today with power functions. So, but it almost went away in 1980. So glad it didn't. Otherwise, we would have had them when we were younger.
So just looking at the crowd, most of us are adults in this room.
Yes.
For adult Lego fans. Can you talk to us a little about the rise of the adult Lego fan.
Absolutely. So trains is actually a perfect segue into that topic. So nicely done, placing those questions one right after the other. So the adult fan community really got its start in the early to mid 1990s, and it was with trains. So the first Lego fan groups were train clubs. And so there were groups of people that had collected, these sets through the 80s and then into the 90s. And they started to gather, and they would do big collaborative layouts where everyone would bring all their track and their trains, and they'd put them all together and make these big displays. And then that led to online groups, and people started to find each other. And so the first Lego conventions were these train clubs, and then they started to expand, obviously, because people started to build towns around them. And then people were like, hey, well, we like space and we like castle. Well, bring those too. We'll have those. And so it started to grow from there. So, and then it began to, it's actually really interesting because they began to get on the Lego Group's radar in the early 2000s. And initially, the Lego Group was a little mortified that adults were still playing with Lego sets into their 40s. And they were actually kind of worried that it would tarnish the brand a little bit if it was that there were some managers that were like, we can't have adults playing with Lego sets. That's weird. And it was actually this Keld Kirk. So this is the third generation owner. So Ole Kirk's grandson. Who really kind of championed it and said, no, this is wonderful. And he, in the early 2000s, he would actually show up just randomly at Lego conventions all over Europe and even here in the US. And he really became kind of the first champion within the Lego Group for the adult community, saying, no, this is, these people can be ambassadors for the brand. They are building these amazing things and then showing them at these conventions. Like, this is advertising we can't possibly buy. Like, this is amazing. And then he also developed some of the first relationships with people within the community. And so that was kind of the first step in kind of beginning to change opinions inside the company and then also move them in the direction of embracing the adult fans. And it was kind of joined in quick succession by three other factors. So the first one is that kind of around that same time in the early 2000s, you began to have the first adult fans become official Lego designers. So up through the 90s, almost exclusively Lego designers were Danish. They were people that lived in the area, either in Denmark or maybe a little bit out into some of the other Scandinavian countries. But in the early 2000s, there started to be, for the first time, people applying for these designer jobs from the US, from Britain, from Australia, from all these places, and they were adult fans. They were people who had grown up loving it, and often people who had displayed at conventions, and they applied to work for the company, and so they started hiring them. And it's really fascinating to talk to some of the designers who were there for that time, because they describe it, they all use the same term, they call it the nights and weekends years. And so what began happening was these guys and girls would stay late and just start, they, for the first time in their lives, they had every brick they could imagine at their disposal. This was awesome. It was the dream. And so after hours, they'd finish their sets of designs, and then they would just sit there together and build these amazing models. And what started happening is managers started coming through and seeing them, and they're like, well, let's make that a set, and let's see what happens. And so initially, these sets that began coming out that were targeted towards these adult audiences, they were not coming from briefs or official directives coming down from management. They were just the pet projects of these designers who were just enjoying the fact that they had unlimited bricks to build with. And so they started to make sets like this. Something like this had never been seen before in the Lego Group's product portfolio. The Statue of Liberty, the Millennium Falcon, all of these big, enormous sets started coming out. And inadvertently also, because the Lego Group didn't know if they would sell or not, so they didn't make that many of them. So it also inadvertently ended up kicking off the secondary market for Lego sets. Anyone who collects Lego sets knows the painful aftermarket prices that we all have to pay if a set is discontinued. And these sets from this era are some of the absolute worst. But they ended up kind of inadvertently kicking off this collectability aspect of it as well by just not making very many of them. And it also just gelled with this third factor, which was this was a time within the Lego Group where there was just a lot of experimentation going on. In 2004, the company actually almost went bankrupt because of just there was really poor sales. They were doing a lot of different experimentation. Just because of competition with video games, they were wondering if the brick was too analog and if they needed to take the company in other directions. And so that was part of the reason they were able to get approval for these types of projects, was there was just this real spirit of experimentation. And some of them, like this guy, were totally awesome, something like we'd never seen before. And some of them some of these experiments we don't talk about anymore. Actually, Galador's a really fascinating story. I wish I had more time, I'd go into it, but that is an official Lego product, and it was crazy that they tried that. But and then lastly, the fourth thing that really helped shift and kick off the adult fan of Lego era was Star Wars. The Lego Star Wars that launched in the late 90s with the release of the prequels, and Star Wars is still going strong today. That had such overlap with an already established adult fan community that it was just kind of a natural. There was so many people who were into Star Wars who happily got into Lego Star Wars and began collecting, but there was one really unique story that kind of highlights that was a real turning point, kind of amidst all of those four factors. It was in the early 2000s, and there was a set that came out. It was part of the Creator 3-in-1 theme. So Creator was kind of Lego has always had a theme that is just bricks, right? Boxes of bricks for free building. And they've called it different things through the years. When I was younger, it was called Basic. And in the early 2000s, it was called Creator. And they released a set in Creator 3-in-1 called Building Bonanza. And I'm going to show it to you now, and you're going to look at it, and you're going to go, huh, that's fine. Because this is what it was. And it was, so it's Creator 3-in-1, so you got instructions for 3 different sets. And by this time, this formula was pretty established, and the Lego group kind of had a good idea of how many of these types of sets would sell. And so they made, the appropriate number of these and didn't think anything of it. And then as soon as it hit shelves, it disappeared. People were buying, these were flying off of shelves to the point that the guys at the factory were going, what is going on? Why do we have to keep producing more of this set? What is so special about Building Bonanza, which was the name of this thing? And as a reference to it, 3 buildings, not building with bricks. Building Bonanza was literally a reference to the subject matter. And so it got to the point where the Lego Group's management commissioned an internal study to try to figure out why, of all things, is Building Bonanza selling out over and over and over again. And what they discovered was it was us. It was adults who were buying 9, 10, 20 copies of Building Bonanza. And the Lego Group, at this point, there were some of the early, there's now a very official ambassador program where the Lego Group actually liaises with adult fans in a very formal way. And at this point, there was kind of a nascent version of that. And so they reached out and they said, why are you buying Building Bonanza? And the answer that came back was, you guys don't make houses anymore. When we were kids in the 80s, you made houses. And so we could have a place for our firefighters to go and put out the fire and all of that. And now we're doing these big convention layouts, and we want neighborhoods. We want neighborhoods to put in our big city layouts. And this is the first house we've had in a decade, and we're afraid you're going to wait another decade to release another one, so we're getting it while we can. And the Lego Group took that and they went, huh, you're telling us there are adults who will buy 20 copies of something? Maybe we should roll with that. And so they actually ended up commissioning then. They actually sent a brief down to the designers, and a gentleman by the name of Jamie Berard, who, if you've watched the Lego Masters show, he's one of the hosts on it. He got this brief, and they said, figure out a way to do neighborhoods, sets of neighborhoods. And so he worked on it for a while, and he was messing around with it, and eventually he kind of settled on this idea of modularity. Well, what if we had, things that could click together, full sets, and you could then arrange it? And I was like, well, that doesn't really work for a neighborhood because, there'd be yards and such, but it would work for an urban environment. You could put apartment buildings next to each other. And that is how we got the modular building line that is very popular now amongst the adult fans. It was literally a direct line from Building Bonanza to those amazing modular buildings. That was how they really began to cater to the adult fans. And then from there, obviously, it's just grown. Now we've got Adults Welcome, and there's whole lines that are targeted just at adults because we'll buy 20 copies.
So one other kind of aspect of Lego that is very popular that I want to talk about is minifigs, minifigurines. Tell us a little bit about them.
Yes. So minifigures are pretty much just as fascinating of a story as the actual Lego brick itself. So the beginning of that story actually comes in the late 60s. We think 1968, though the exact date has been lost to history. Where the Lego Group hired a trio of female designers. They wanted to very specifically find ways to cater and bring girls into the Lego hobby in a very intentional way. And at the time, when they began to look at it, they said, well, in Denmark at the time, doll houses were very popular. That was a primary toy that was being sold. And they said, well, we can't really do doll houses because that's just too many bricks. Like they did some experiments with them. They're actually really cool. There's pictures of them in the archive, but I mean, they would have cost like $1,000 if you adjust for inflation. But they said, well, what we could do is we could do furniture. You could take Lego bricks and you could then build the tables and the chairs and the dressers and all of those things within, and then place them in third-party doll houses with third-party dolls. And so that is exactly what they did. So these were released in the early 70s, 1974, and they were these accessories for doll houses. They had to make a whole bunch of new parts, all these opening cabinets and drawers. They're actually really cool elements even today. And these ended up being very, very popular. And so very quickly thereafter, they said, well, hey, instead of just leaving them as third party, why don't we make figures ourselves to populate these? And so they began to do experiments with them, but because they were scaled to doll houses, they said, well, they have to be bigger, right? They have to be the size of dolls at the time. And so they ended up making these. These are the buildable figures from the mid-70s. I'm sorry, the ones I just showed you, those were 1971. This was 1974. So you can see there's articulation. They have the ability to move their arms and their heads. And it's just like minifigures today. There's the hair can pop off. But then they didn't want to invest too much because they didn't know if it would work. And so they said, well, the legs have to be regular bricks. You have to make those with the bricks that are being produced at the time. So you can only have the arms and the heads. The archive actually has parts that they did draw up for articulated legs. They are actually terrifying. I'm really glad they didn't go with them. But at the end, it ended up being cost that was the primary driver. So they made these in the mid-70s, and those ended up being, again, very, very popular, but they were too big, right? They actually did make some vehicles and stuff associated with those, and they're just, way too large to, imagine a bus or a car to house all of those, would be very expensive. And so they started to experiment with, can we make them smaller? Can we make these figures at a reduced scale? And there was an interim step of experimentation. These are, as far as we know, the earliest minifigure prototypes, and this is from what is referred to as the hack and slash era. So these are all existing parts that they then cut with saws and knives and everything, and they were carving these parts out of. That's actually how we can date them, because we know when that Red Cross element was produced. But you can see, like, it's a regular 1x2 brick. They've cut off the studs. They've glued this monstrosity of a head onto it. There's actually a whole line of these that just get progressively more terrifying. So these were the early experiments with it, and very quickly they made progress on it. And they actually released what we call the transitional form, which is known internally as the stage extra. So you can see it's a regular minifigure head, but it had this kind of static body. Because they wanted to see, well, will kids respond to this? Will figures help things sell better before we invest all the money in, because to insert arms and legs and all that, it was completely new equipment that they would have to invest in. So this was the kind of proof of concept released in the mid-70s. And it was hugely successful because it allowed role play for the first time in a really meaningful way within Lego sets. Whereas before it had all been vehicles, Town Plan was all cars driving in an urban setting, but now you could go in and you could tell stories within a home or within a setting like the Wild West or a seaport or something like that, which is what the types of sets were that they had that. And so this is kind of the evolution. You had what we affectionately refer to now as the big figs, followed by the stage extras, and then of course the actual minifigures themselves. And yeah, there have been a bunch of other variants of figures through the years, Belleville and Scala and stuff. And then of course Lego Friends with the mini dolls here in the last decade. But that was where it started. That was how we got to them. Oh yeah, mini dolls. That had a quick picture of that. So
Just very quickly, how are we doing on time?
am I talking too long? Sorry.
6:42. Okay, cool.
I can go fast.
All right, so we've got 2 more questions. Pirate ships.
Pirate ships, best Lego sets ever. Changed my mind. So pirate ships, yes. So this is actually one of the early sketches. Gentleman who designed them, Niels Milan, shared with me. So early on, they wanted to again introduce more. The idea with the Lego minifigures at first was a past, a present, and a future line. And so it was castle for past, town for present, and space for future. But by the late 80s, they wanted to expand it, and they wanted to go up. They wanted to go big. They wanted to have, so they ended up going with pirates. It was actually ready in the mid 80s, but they ended up waiting because Castle was so successful they didn't have room on the production lines. There were a variety of different themes. They actually were co-producing this with a theme based on ancient Rome, and also a theme that was kind of like a Napoleonic Wars type theme, and they figured they could use the hulls of the ships for all 3 of them. And so, yeah, this was a major advancement for the Lego group of going and building these kind of tall, big sets that really kind of pushed the limits of the scaling of the minifigure. And they're just some of the best sets ever. This was an early prototype of what became the Black Seas Barracuda, which was the first of the Lego pirate ships, the ones with the red and white candy sails. And yeah, so great theme. I love pirates.
Okay, so I've got one more question for you before we
Yes.
open up to audience questions. So thank you for your good questions now. Where do you see the Lego company going?
Yeah, so it's actually a really interesting time to be in the toy business because of just digital experiences, mobile video games, all of that becoming just so much more immersive. When I was a kid, you sat down, you played a video game, you sat there for 2 hours, and you beat it, and then you didn't have anything else to do. But now, things are so much more immersive. And so what the Lego group has really been doing is there's kind of 3 strategies that they've been focused on of the last several years. So the first is, as anyone who has seen a Lego aisle recently will know, is licensing. There's a lot of licensed products. This was actually a thing I did for a Blocks article where we looked at what is the percentage of non-licensed versus licensed. And you can see it used to be that there was a lot licensed is orange and non-licensed is blue. So it used to be that there were more non-licensed themes than licensed, but in 2015 that changed, and that gap has only gotten farther since. And again, it makes sense. Licensed, those multimedia properties are things that, again, they're selling to kids, and kids remember the thing they saw the most recently. So if you can tie it to things that they're constantly seeing on TV and on T-shirts and talking about with their friends and going to the movies and all of that, then it's much easier. So there's licensing. And then also they've been expanding their range of products into kind of non-traditional spaces, things like the botanical lines, kind of appealing to these niche interests. And making products for them. So it is kind of broadening their horizons into other markets. And then lastly, tapping directly into nostalgia. So we often on Blocks put up on the covers, these sets that they've released. This is a set from a few years ago. Just found out it's retiring this year, so get it while you can. Which is a direct reference to the castle themes from the 1980s. So tapping into the nostalgia of the adult market is also a very tried and true strategy for the Lego group, because there are people who will buy 3 and 4 copies of that to combine together at a convention. So
Awesome. So we'll open it up to audience questions. We do, if you want to raise your hand, we have mics floating around. So don't be we have a first question right back here.
Hi. What happened in 2005 with the licensing and non-licensing?
Oh, in terms of the switch? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it was actually 2015, not 2005, I think. Yes, that one. So yes, that's a great question. So what happened there was, that was when the Lego group learned a very hard lesson. So Star Wars had been so successful that they said, licensing is the solution. We're just going to license everything. But Star Wars was super successful because there were movies coming out. And when the Star Wars prequels ended, the sales cratered. And so Lego went, holy crap, licensing isn't the answer. And they reversed course really majorly for 1 year. That's what happened in 2005. No.
So what was the company doing before they invented the bricks?
Oh, another great question. They, it was... so before they invented the bricks, it was primarily wooden toys, as just continuing on from what they started in the Depression. So they did a bunch of vehicles and then little like figurines. The real famous one is the wooden duck with the beak that goes up and down when you pull it along. But it was wooden toys, and then they also were slowly starting to do small selections of plastic toys. Their most successful one to date before the brick kind of began to dominate was actually a tractor called the Ferguson tractor. That had a bunch of accessories and things that they sold. And that was actually what got them enough money to invest in the Lego bricks when Godford had that ferry ride. If they hadn't had the Ferguson tractor, they wouldn't have had the money to invest in it.
Yeah, you may have just answered it with before, but I'm curious what the biggest flop was and what the biggest sleeper hit was.
Oh, good questions. There have been several flops, but none greater than Galador. This was an absolute disaster of epic proportions. So this was actually tied to a TV show that cratered at the same time. You can't even find it. It is on no streaming service. You have to watch these grainy videos on YouTube, and that is not the only reason they are unwatchable. But this was them trying to break into the action figure market. They're actually really unique toys. All of the limbs can separate, and so you can interchange them and kind of build your own figures. Gets a little weird, but from a conceptual perspective, it works great. So this was, but far and away, they had to invest in like 70 new molds. They paid for the TV show. I mean, it was bad. In terms of sleeper hit, Ninjago is far and away the one. So they originally were thinking that was a period of time where they did what they called in and out themes, where they designed themes to last 2 or 3 years, and that was it. Ninjago was absolutely supposed to be that, and then it just exploded, and they canceled it, and everyone freaked out. And they said, okay, we'll bring it back, and it's still going strong.
So you've talked about some of the research you've done, some of the prototyping and stuff, and kind of your quest for what was the ratio, like where did this come from? I'm curious, when you're kind of having all these interviews, looking at all these original documents, were there any things that you saw them exploring that was like a path not taken that you found really interesting or compelling?
Oh, so many. The number of products that come to market are dwarfed by the number that don't. There were so many different paths that they, whether it's themes or sets, for like every set that makes it to market in any given price point, there are 5 others that were competing with it at one point. The whole product development, the amount of things that they get rid of and don't do is absolutely incredible. So yeah, there were tons of paths that were not taken, especially in the digital space. There were a lot of different things that they experimented with. At one point, just to give one example, there was a entire line of products that they called Band Booster, which was almost like a guitar band game type of thing, where it was these buildable Lego instruments, and they were all programmable, and you could plug them in. And so there are tons of things like that where as you go through the archive, you see, oh, they spent a ton of money developing that and then never released it. So yeah, there's a bunch of paths not taken.
Over the last few years, it seems like there's been a huge rise in compatible bricks from other manufacturers. Is there a reason for that particularly happening now? And also, what are your opinions on non-Lego brand compatible pieces?
Well, I will say I'm a purist, so I never touch the non-compatible ones. Partly out of principle, and then partly they're usually not as good of quality in terms of the clutch power and the grip strength. But to the first part of your question, it's primarily just copycat. The Lego Group, if you look at their sales numbers over the last 10 years, the Lego Movie back in 2014 really catapulted them into becoming a real touchstone of the cultural zeitgeist, and their sales shot up accordingly. And so whenever you have something like that, and Lego products are uniquely easy to copy in some ways because you can just produce, compatible bricks, and then you can, if you produce them cheaply, you can copy, exact set designs and things like that, and then sell them much cheaper. But it's as far as the Lego Group knows, it's purely a matter of, hey, there's money to be made copying what they're doing because of how successful they are. So.
I wonder if you could speak to how the design process has changed over time, like pre-software through, I guess now they're using software. And then also if what software or what design methods the people who don't work for Lego are using to create their creations.
Oh, great questions. Wow, there's a whole talk in there. Let me try to sum it up very quickly. There is a real delineation within the Lego Group in terms of the design right at about the year 2000. So because of the crisis that they had where they almost went bankrupt, they ended up completely revamping how they did their design. So before that period of time, it really was the ideas that the designers had. Designers did everything from coming up with the ideas to doing the prototyping to making their own parts and then ultimately designing the sets. And what you see after the crisis of the early 2000s is that it becomes a much more formalized process. They use a phase gate approach. Each one of those steps is split out into different teams. So now there's a team who it's just their idea, just their job to get ideas. And then there's a team that it's just their job to do prototyping. They do all these drawings and they show them to kids, kid test after kid test after kid test. Everything that makes it to market has been tested within an inch of its life. And that was really that distinction between the pre-2000s and the post-2000s. In terms of software, so yes, now it's all digital. So designers, almost everything is initially done in the computer, and then they will go to physically prototyping after that. And the Lego Group has actually made versions of that software available to the fan community. So you can download these designer programs off of sites like Bricklink, where that is a version of the same program that the designers are using. Not quite as powerful and all of that, of course, but still very, very, very cool to use. So within the fan community, it runs the gamut. There's people who do just digital, and then there's people who do digital and then will build it in person. Then there's people like me who I just can't think into the computer. I have to do it tactile, so I have to do it with bricks first. So it really runs the gamut within the fan community.
I think we have time for one more question. Where are mics traveling to? Oh, back there.
Hi, I'm curious your thought on the social media influencer strategy that Lego's adopted of sending free sets to people who then talk about them for 20 seconds on TikTok, and how has that changed the market or changed the Lego community?
Yeah, so I really think that is just kind of indicative of what I was talking about here at the end with kind of that diversification strategy. They're really now making products that are, really catering to all these different niches. And so, a lot of the normal channels of how, fans like me find out about stuff, someone who is going to be interested in, the latest Technic supercar because they're into vehicles, they're not going to be tied into those same, kind of, for lack of a better term, hardcore Lego channels like people like me are. And so, having avenues where you can get the word out to those people and show them, hey, there's this cool thing that we made. It seems like a natural extension of that strategy to me. So it makes sense.
Cool. So I think we're at time.
All right.
So thank you so much for coming tonight.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Talk about
This
Legos.
was a lot of fun.
Of course. If you would like to get a copy of your book signed, we're going to be starting a line right outside of this room. And I'm sure you'll be signing some copies for them. All right. Well, thank you guys so much.